Everybody, I am the president of the HBS Club of Toronto. We have with us Kay Valiev, the president of the HBS Club of Calgary. We have been delighted to collaborate and have discussions with the presidents of your local clubs and associations. And we're very glad to see HBS, Harvard alumni, and guests from Canada, the US, Asia, and Australia with us. And it's great to see people sharing where they're located in the chat box. Please keep it coming. And we wanted to speak a little bit with you about the logistics of today's presentation. As soon as we've concluded the introductions, Professor Felix Oberholzer-Gee will speak regarding his recent book, Better, Simpler Strategy. We will ask some questions and then open up the floor for questions to folks in the audience. One thing that we're doing for the first time, and we're excited to do, is offer for you folks an opportunity to join us on camera. We'd like for you to put your hand up, raise your hand, and then we will promote folks in the audience to panelists. Please do note that the session is being recorded, and obviously once you join us, once you ask questions, you would be on video, but we are HBS, Harvard, we are professionals here, so certainly that would not be and isn't an obstacle, I'm certain. So we'd like to see some raised hands, please, shortly to promote people to panelists so that you can join us in this discussion and make it more interactive for yourselves, for Professor Oberholzer-Gee, and the rest of the team. Okay, I have one taker already, promoting to panelists now. Excellent. Please keep it coming. In the meanwhile, Felix Oberholzer-Gee is the Andreas Anderson Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. He's an award-winning instructor, with his academic work having been published in the very best peer-reviewed journals of his profession. He currently teaches competitive strategy in executive education programs such as the Harvard General Management Program. He also serves as faculty chair of the Senior Executive Leadership Program for China and the Driving Digital Strategy Program. And it is quite appropriate that we have folks from China and from Asia joining us today. Once again, welcome. Professor Oberholzer-Gee is also co-host of the popular HBR Presents podcast called After Hours. Hope you're watching that show and is enjoying it as much as I am. And then on the book that we're going to discuss, Better, Simpler Strategy, it's a fantastic guide to get better, more effective strategy. In nearly every business segment and corner of the world economy, the most successful companies dramatically outperform their rivals. What is their secret, we say? Well, in Better, Simpler Strategy, Professor Oberholzer-Gee shows how these companies achieve more by doing less. At a time when rapid technological change and global competition conspire to upend traditional ways of doing business, these companies pursue radically simplified strategies. At a time when many managers struggle not to drown in vast seas of projects and initiatives, these businesses actually follow simpler rules that help select the few ideas that truly make a difference. I'm delighted and excited to welcome Professor Oberholzer-Gee and to hear more on Better, Simpler Strategy. Over to you, Felix, and welcome. Great to have you with us.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me tonight, Boris and Kay. I'm grateful that you brought us together and grateful for the opportunity to talk about better, simpler strategy. I have to say, this is extra special for me because when I look at the list of participants, I see so many names that I recognize. And so I really feel this is more a conversation among friends. And I hope that a good number of you will join us here as panelists so that we can have a little bit of back and forth the way we're used to it from good old HBS days. The plan for today is that I will talk about the book for the first 25 minutes or so, and then we will open it up for questions. So keep the questions warm if you think of things that either don't make much sense to you or the kinds of things that you want to follow up on, I'd be delighted to get to the questions towards the end of the presentation. But I'll get us started out by showing you a little bit of the research that went into the book. And the very first thing that I did was that I wanted to do tonight was to talk a little bit about two overarching principles, if you will, for the book. The first one is one of optimism. If you ask me, how optimistic should I be that my company can perform at a much better level than we perform today? I will tell you, you should be pretty optimistic. There's a lot of run room to improve. And those of you who know me personally, they know I happen to be an optimistic person myself, but this actually has nothing to do with my personal optimism. This is just straight from the data. When I started writing the book, when I started the research in the book, the first thing that I did was I looked at performance data. Data of the type that you see here in this particular slide. So this shows the distribution of return on invested capital for large companies in the US over a long period of time. And I still remember when I first saw this type of data, I don't know about you, but I was very surprised that it looks this way. I somehow hadn't quite expected, I mean, the part that I expected was many companies that are not differentiated, they will have returns on invested capital that are close to the cost of capital. And that's in fact what you see here in the graph, where you sort of see the bunching of the curve. That's around 8 to 10%, and that's the cost of capital. So no surprise there. But then look at the tail. Isn't the tail really just like amazing, surprising, fabulous? So there are some companies that have return on invested capital 30%, 35%, 40%. And this is not, you know, you have a great quarter or if you have a fantastic year. This is over a 10-year period. And by the way, this is not a US phenomenon, as many of you probably know. If you look around the world, look at China, look at India, look at Brazil, look at South Korea, time after time after time, you have the same observation. And you can think maybe looking at this country by country sort of covers up interesting differences. The US and Canada are so service oriented at this point in time. China has a much larger manufacturing sector, obviously. So let's look at it segment by segment, business segment by business segment. So this is the same chart. Each bar shows the distribution of return on invested capital. The left-hand whisker is the 10th percentile. The 90th, the right-hand whisker is the 90th percentile. And, you know, you look at this and you go, oh my God, the differences couldn't be bigger. And so two answers or two really interesting insights to begin with. The first one is, if you ask me how much room for improvement, unless you're telling me I'm out of this world successful to begin with, I'm telling you a lot of improvement possibilities. And the second is, if you ask me, where are my best opportunities? The answer, I think, out of the data is your best opportunities are close to home, are close to where you are today. Because if you look at the chart, what you see is that there's much more within industry variation as opposed to variation across industries. As opposed to, you know, the grass is greener on the other side. Just think about what could I do to close the gap with the best companies in my segment. And these effects can be really large. I'll give you one example. Say you're exactly average in your segment, and I move you from rank 50 to rank 40. So 100 companies, you're ranked 50th, I move you to rank 40. So I'm not making you a superstar company. I'm just improving your performance by 10 ranks. Your return on invested capital will increase by 20%. Isn't this amazing? So there's so much improvement. And then, of course, you know, this is no surprise. You're asking, okay, so there's a lot of opportunity. How do I actually do it? And then my first intuition was that probably what I'm going to see is very sophisticated strategies. Companies that do really amazing things, really elaborate schemes. And so my second surprise doing the research for the book was, in the end, when you think about the sources of success, It is just amazingly simple. Essentially, all these really successful companies do is one of two things. They raise willingness to pay of their customers. You remember willingness to pay, the most the customer would ever be willing to pay, or they lower willingness to sell for employees and suppliers. Now, willingness to sell is a little less common in the vocabulary of strategists, so let me quickly explain the idea. Think of a person who does not work for your company today, but you would like her to join your organization. You're writing the offer letter and you're thinking about what's the minimum compensation that I have to offer to make the person move. That minimum compensation is her willingness to sell. If the job is an amazing job, it's dream come true to work for your company, it takes less money, so willingness to sell goes down. If the job is, I don't know, not so interesting or maybe physically very demanding, it'll take more money to lure her to your company, so willingness to sell goes up. So think of willingness to pay and willingness to sell as the two levers that companies use to create value, and then, as we see in the data, to capture value as well. So I thought it would be most interesting if I talk a little bit about some of the insights that I had writing the book. I didn't want to present sort of the way the book is organized. I thought I would give you a little bit of a behind the scenes kind of look and just talk about some of the things that I found particularly interesting, some of the takeaways that I had as I was working on the book. The first one, and I'm not sure if you remember, is this amazing turnaround. You go back 10 years or so, and everybody that I know, and including myself, we were totally convinced that Best Buy would go out of business. Because remember, Circuit City had gone out of business, everybody else was basically in trouble. And there was a view that there's just no chance you can compete with Amazon. How on earth, you have 1,000 stores? You gotta be kidding me, you're dead in the water. They lost $1 billion a quarter. And then a new CEO comes in, and he basically does two things. It's really just two ideas. The first idea is, instead of thinking of the stores as a liability, think of stores as an asset. We're thinking of every store as a mini warehouse from which we can ship at rapid speeds. So we're not building any of these big distribution centers. We're just shipping from the stores, because guess what? All the stores are really close to where the consumers live. Raising willingness to pay, because it turns out electronics customers are super, super impatient. About half of them actually walk to the store and they pick up what they ordered, and they buy warranties and everything else. The second thing that he does is he goes to Microsoft, he goes to Samsung, he goes to all of these electronics vendors, and he says, well, you can go the Apple route and you can spend millions of dollars building really beautiful stores, or you can, in an old-fashioned department store of way, you can build stores within Best Buy. And that's what all of them do. And that dramatically lowers willingness to sell, because it's so much cheaper to build just a store within a store as opposed to building freestanding stores that look really beautiful. What happens? They go from losing $1 billion a quarter to now a return on invested capital north of 25%, with basically two ideas. And I have seen this to be true over and over and over again. I visit many companies. This is obviously pre-pandemic, but I visit many companies, and because I write many cases. And one of the things I have to say, I'm always surprised and impressed by how many projects are going on at one at the same time. Last I checked, you don't have an unlimited budget. It's not always easy to hire the right people. And yet there's always 100 things going on at one at the same time. And so that always gives me in a way, it just makes me really proud. The kinds of things we can do in business is really amazing to me. But then what's also true is, when I look at these initiatives, when I look at these projects, sometimes for a third of them, sometimes for half of them, I cannot possibly imagine how they increase willingness to pay or how they decrease willingness to sell. It's just unrelated. Don't do that. Pursue fewer projects. In fact, what I would love for you to do, tomorrow's Friday, so maybe not Friday, but Monday. Look at the list of the projects that you have. Are there some where you cannot figure out how they increase willingness to pay or how they decrease willingness to sell? If so, don't do that. You don't have the luxury to engage in activities that don't create value. And in fact, the most successful companies get their success from surprisingly few initiatives that dramatically increase willingness to pay or willingness to sell. We all remember this. Nokia in 2007, a phone for everyone. I mean, if you look at this portfolio of phones and you don't find your phone, I'm not exactly sure what to make of you. And then it goes through hell in a handbasket, and the guy has just one product. It's one thing, and it's out of this world amazing. Or think of Google. How much of Google's current performance depends on that very first idea about how to do better search? They do a million things, and it's still just a search company. So that's a first insight. And the second thing that I found very interesting is how many of these high-performing companies essentially compete on selection. Here's an example. This is a South African health insurance company, Discovery. And they partner with local retailers, local food stores to provide members with amazing discounts on healthy food. Sometimes the discount is a third, sometimes it's 50% off, sometimes it's 70% off. Why do they do this? Eric, what's your intuition? Why would a health insurance company partner with supermarkets to provide healthy foods to its members? You're still muted?
Yeah, I had to find it. Yeah, because it would do two things. It would cement a relationship with people who can eat better, and they get a deal, they get healthy food, and then they get healthier. And so, of course, claims, in theory, claims would go down.
Yeah,
over time.
Perfect. Yeah, exactly right. So on the one hand, of course, it increases willingness to pay because now as a member of the Discovery family, I get access to this amazing selection of food. And then we always think about the direct effect on willingness to pay. When I first learned about Discovery, I had exactly the same reaction as Eric. And then it turns out the main benefit is actually not that you get healthier when you eat healthy foods for a long period of time. Guess what? It takes a long period of time. It's maybe a little uncertain if it's really going to happen or not. The main effect is who is actually attracted to a health insurance company that has an offer of healthy foods. Eric, what's your intuition? Who finds this particularly attractive?
Well, I actually think people who value healthy food.
Yeah.
As opposed to people who don't.
That's right. It's the health conscious people. They're healthy to begin with. It's all a selection effect. They have amazingly low cost. And a little bit might come from, people having better eating habits, but it's mostly selection. And so I would like you to always ask two questions. First question is, I have an idea, I have a project, I have an initiative. Does it increase willingness to pay? Does it decrease willingness to sell? If not, end of conversation. Second, who's going to be particularly attracted by what you're about to do? What's the selection effect? And that plays in the willingness to pay space, but it also plays in willingness to sell. Look at Uber. Uber has twice as many women drivers as taxi companies. How can that be? Can you imagine, like, if you double the pool of potential drivers, the business impact that this has? Really amazing. And of course, they just do two really interesting things. They provide great flexibility and they make the job a safer job. Who looks at a safer job and says, oh my God, that's like a better job? Women, more safety conscious. So think about the selection effects that you can induce by increasing willingness to pay or decreasing willingness to sell. Third, this chart really, I don't know about you, it just blew me away. So this is Apple's gross margins in the last 10 years. You see on the hardware side, the iPhone in particular, margins have decreased by about 20% or so. And then look at the App Store. The App Store is basically on fire. what is happening here, dear panelists? What is Apple thinking? Gary, do you want to take a shot?
They're kind of a monopoly.
So they have market power in the App Store, right? So this is the court battle with Epic Games, of course, but that's been true for a long time. Why would they
got smarter at it?
increase margins in the App Store and now have falling margins on hardware?
Razor blade.
Razor blade. Very good. Excellent. Fantastic.
Yeah.
One of many reasons why I love to talk to alums. So this is the classic complement story, right? Hardware and content and software, those are complements. And remember the nature of complements. If the price of a complement falls, willingness to pay for the other product goes up. So what happens at Apple? Well, the phone used to be really one of a kind, just amazing. Now, maybe a little less so. I mean, you heard 2 days ago, they improved battery life a little bit. That helps. But is it the best camera? Definitely not. Like if you want the best camera, your phone is not an iPhone. And so what do? So much more competition on the hardware side. As a result, they shift the profit pool from hardware to software. I find that is super powerful and is one of the recipes how companies cement success over long periods of time. It creates a kind of strategic flexibility that is particularly valuable if you're not sure how technology will evolve, how consumer tastes will evolve. I'll give you one more example that I think is very instructive. This is a little while back. Amazon thinks that the future of books is ebooks. And in ebooks, basically, there's no differentiation possible because an ebook is an ebook is an ebook. You get instantaneous delivery. It's really hard to imagine how you would set yourself apart. So Amazon's view is prices of ebooks are going to crash because there's going to be intense competition in ebooks. It's a smart company. They know every time a price falls, willingness to pay for complement goes up at the same time. Right? That's the big insight. Every time you see a price fall, think about what's the complement, because willingness to pay for the complement goes up. Here, the complement is e-readers. So a little surprisingly, because they're not an electronics company, they come out with the Kindle. And the idea is we're giving away ebooks for cheap and we're having beautiful margins on the Kindle. And what I love about this story is everything about this conjecture is totally wrong. Ebooks are not quite as popular as, as we once thought. It's now about 20% market share or so. But at the same time, the market for e-readers is competitive like you wouldn't believe. Apple has one, Microsoft has one, Lenovo has one. What does Amazon do? Oh, we just bring down the price of the Kindle. They now lose about $100 every time they sell one. And we shift the profit pool to ebooks. If you checked ebooks lately, not so much cheaper than hardcover. So that's the strategic flexibility that we did, right? Because you don't quite know when technology, how technology will evolve. You don't quite know how consumer tastes evolve. And if you have pairs of complements, you can shift profit pools back and forth in an interesting way. If the complements are produced by someone else, you will get pushback, right? That's the background to the Epic Games lawsuit against Apple, where we got the big judge decision about a day ago. But generally speaking, this is a great opportunity to move profits from where you have intense competition to places where competition is less intense. Now, if you've been at HBS and it's been a little while, you might remember in your strategy class very early on in the course, this idea of being stuck in the middle. Remember, that was sort of like hell for strategists, right? You're stuck in the middle. And I think Mike Porter and Warren Buffett had like this big view of being stuck in the middle. And the basic idea was very simple. You cannot aspire to have high willingness to pay and be low cost at one at the same time. If you're trying to do both of these things at the same time, the outcome is not going to be happy. And I think the logic was probably sort of a manufacturing logic. How do you get higher willingness to pay? You need better inputs, and better inputs are more costly, and so you can't have a cost advantage. And in particular, if you decide to do both, or if you don't make up your mind, you're stuck in the middle. Today, that is no longer true. I'm actually not quite sure if this was ever really true, but in today's data, it's definitely not true. Company after company after company has dual advantages. An advantage in willingness to pay and an advantage in willingness to sell at one and the same time. And let me just give you one example. This is literally one of dozens and dozens of examples. So this is Japan, Raksul. In the beginning, just a website that matches companies that have printing jobs with printing shops. And you go on Raksul and you see all the printing companies. For some reason, Japan has an insane number of printing companies, 30,000 or so. And so you see them, you see their prices, and you pick whoever you like. And then the founder of Raksul thinks, well, couldn't I add more value somehow? And he starts thinking about, oh, if I pair the right business, the right print job with the right kind of equipment, wonderful things might happen. Sure enough, quality goes up because if you print on the right equipment, that produces better outcomes. And because you print on the right equipment, you have lower costs. So dual advantages right there and then. And then he thinks, oh, maybe I should match a print job with a print shop that doesn't have much work. Because what? Opportunity cost of using these machines near zero, they would stand idle. And so costs really go down. And then he hires a bunch of Toyota engineers, and they go to all of these print shops and they optimize their operations. And now you have the sweetest of outcomes. You have just incredibly, incredibly low cost. You have quality like you wouldn't believe. And they essentially start to dominate the Japanese market for printing. It happens time and time again. Every idea that you have, how to increase willingness to pay, think about, isn't that idea in one way or another a great idea to also lower willingness to sell? Every idea you have how to lower willingness to sell, isn't that in one way or another also a great way to increase willingness to pay? Dual advantages are here to stay. Most of the leading companies that I have studied, they have an advantage in willingness to pay and an advantage in willingness to sell. Don't be afraid of being stuck in the middle. If it exists at all, it's not super relevant for the very best firms. And then the last idea that I wanted to share with you, and this is from the last third of the book, is all about strategy implementation. Because one thing I noticed when I worked with companies is that many companies have strategic plans. And then, you spend a little bit of time with the sales force, or you spend a little time in the R&D lab, and it's really hard to see that strategy come alive. Like somehow the strategy is a beautiful PowerPoint deck in the boardroom or on the CEO's desk. It's not a strategy that really lives in the organization. And so I thought a lot about how do you go from having a sense of how you want to compete in the marketplace, how you increase willingness to pay or decrease willingness to sell, to really rolling this out in the organization. And the tool that I have become enamored with is called a value map. Here's what a value map does. A value map decomposes willingness to pay for customers or willingness to sell for employees and suppliers, if that's where your main competitive advantage comes from. And it's a simple graph where you list the drivers, the value drivers for willingness to pay, from most important to the customer to least important for the customer. The example that I'm showing you here, this is from one of the leading digital European banks, Tatra Banka, and for their customer, this is for the premium income segment, for their customers, an excellent mobile app is more important than anything else. That the bank is easily accessible so that they have branches close by, that they have long opening hours, that's the least important element, the least important value drivers. And then you map these value drivers against the performance of the competition. And you see two things. You see your competitive advantage. you have a sense of how you can deepen that competitive advantage relative to everyone else. But you can also see the kind of thing that I think is still the hardest thing to do for ambitious people. You see what you shouldn't do. You see where you shouldn't spend time, where you shouldn't spend money, where you shouldn't spend capital. I have obviously never been in a strategy meeting in your company, but if I had to guess, you're making long lists of things that you want to do better. And it's mostly a waste of time, I hate to tell you. Why? Well, last I checked, you were sort of busy to begin with. Like, how are you adding 70 things if in fact you struggle to complete all the projects on time that you wanted to do to begin with? And so choosing trade-offs, choosing the kinds of things that you don't want to do, that is really hard. Like, as a smart, ambitious people, including myself, that is like, it's just breaking our soul not to do things, to let things slide, to not be excellent in some dimension. But you got to do it because it gives you the resources to be really excellent where it counts. And so these value maps I have found are just marvelous in helping you to go from a sense of how you want to compete, how you create value, how is it that you increase willingness to pay or decrease willingness to sell, to then actually pick a family of value drivers that is really crucial, and then develop projects around the family of value drivers. This is for customers. This is very similar for employees. So this is for bank tellers. One thing that it's interesting here in the customer segment, of course, we're competing with other banks. Here, when it comes for competition for talent, we're competing with very different companies. We're competing with Amazon. We're competing with a telecom company. We're competing with McDonald's even. So that's a wonderful transition. If anyone is really interested, I have a step-by-step guide how to develop these value maps and then how to create projects around these value maps. If that's something that's of interest to you, I'm easy to find. You have my address right there. So 5 things I learned. We're all doing too many projects. We're just scattered. We're pushing on many fronts without thinking about where do I really have the potential to create extra value. Carefully think about competing on selection. Compliments, such a powerful move, in particular if they live in-house, so that you can shift profit pools. That business about stuck in the middle, not so relevant in 2021. And then really important, no matter how you do it, to think about how do I go from the beautiful deck that describes my strategy to actually bringing the strategy alive in my business. And with that, let me stop sharing my screen so that we can have a conversation.
Thank you, Felix. That was very insightful. I appreciate it. Even a simple presentation you laid out. That was lovely. Now we're going to move into the Q&A portion of the presentation. And we really want this to be interactive. Felix would like this to be interactive. So raise your hand and we can put you through as a panelist to ask your question directly. To start us off, Boris and I have 2 questions that we will ask. And in the meantime, please start formulating your questions and raising your hand. So Felix, the first question is mainly for people in Alberta, Canada. We have a lot of oil and gas related companies. So how would you implement this strategy in commodity or highly commoditized industries?
So it's such a great question. When I talk to executives and they say, oh, you know, my industry is completely commoditized, I always have 2 reactions. I think often commoditization comes from defining your product in a very narrow way, right? So it's literally just the oil or the gas that comes out of the ground. I did a project with a large oil company, and that's about a year ago, and it's exactly where we started the conversation. They came and said, oh, totally commoditized. And then it turns out that there were all of these other things that their clients cared about. For instance, they're very reluctant to ever use force majeure as a reason not to live up to their contracts. And as a result, before you know it, they get a little bit of a price premium. They're very good at delivering on time. They're really easy to work with. And so before we go down that route to say, oh my God, it's so difficult, my industry is commoditized, let's take seriously that there might be many value drivers that sort of don't have to do with the narrow product. In fact, if we make the definition of a product or a service narrow enough, almost everybody is commoditized, but really encompass everything that customers think about. And then second, I'll say is there are, of course, truly commoditized products or services. So if you're, I don't know, if you're trading treasury bonds, at least we hope a treasury bond is a treasury bond is a treasury bond. There is no differentiation there. And then I see the advantage that comes to these companies. I still see big differences in profitability, but it just comes from the other end of the value stick. So you might be commoditized in willingness to pay, then all your attention shifts to what are my opportunities to create differentiation in willingness to sell, and vice versa. If you're completely commoditized on the input side, then you're thinking about, okay, so my only hope is really that I have a competitive advantage on the willingness to pay side. There are companies that have only one side advantage, right? Well, Apple's advantage only lives in willingness to pay. Walmart's advantage only lives in willingness to sell, and that's totally okay. And actually, I find, maybe this is the last comment, in the S&P 500, sometimes people ask, is it better to be in willingness to pay or is it better to play in willingness to sell? And interestingly, it's almost, for the S&P 500, it's almost 50-50. I see as many companies that have their advantage with customers as companies that have their advantage with suppliers and talent.
Great. Okay, that's clear. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Felix. And in thinking through selecting ideas and the mapping exercise that you've shown for, let's say, an average business, whatever that may be, and then Kay has just talked about something on this side, which is a commodity. What if we flip to somewhere over here and people are talking about startup ideas, technology ideas, and I know that you've done a lot in that space and with technology innovation. When people think their ideas are extremely different, extremely distinct, maybe it's startups in its early stage and it's not very clear regarding what the willingness to pay, willingness to sell is. How would you advise to sift through all of the ideas and narrow down in that situation?
I think for very many innovations, the usual marketing techniques that we use actually work pretty okay. Even, if it pushes the boundary, as long as our customers have a rough understanding of what the product will do, how it will, impact their life or professional opportunities that come along, things like conjoint analysis, figuring out price elasticities of demand, doing pricing experiments, all of that stuff works relatively well. If you're one of these rare birds and you have an idea that, like, I don't even know what your product is going to do for me, then of course the traditional marketing methods break down. Right? So there are these instances. They're relatively rare. I think we're doing many more experiments now, in particular in an online world. I think that's a very powerful method to have customers experience what a particular service is like, and then try to best monetize it. But generally speaking, I think the real art here is when you see the value drivers, to think about where do you want to double down. The single biggest mistake that I see time after time after time is that people play catch up, right? They look at the value map, they think, oh my God, I've fallen behind in XYZ. And then instead of creating a trade-off where you really have an advantage in one dimension, they're trying to play catch up. They're investing money. And then before you know it, your value stick looks like my value stick. And then how do customers choose? They choose based on price. I meet so many people who tell me, look, in my industry, it's actually pretty hard because customers are so price sensitive. And I'm always thinking, it's not the customers, it's you. If your value stick is like everybody else's value stick, how on earth am I supposed to choose? Of course I choose based on price. And so it's just, if you see price sensitive customers, it just tells you that in their view, maybe right, maybe not right, but in their view, you're just like everybody else. And that, I think, is the biggest trap here.
Very interesting and very useful. Thank you. And we have 3 questions lined up already. Eric, please.
I have more than one, so.
Oh,
But I have a
choose
question
your
and a
best
comment.
one, Eric.
So I'll make one comment. I'll just add a comment that occurred to me as you're talking. My question is going to be to go back to your value map because I find it very intriguing. But I'll just make the comment that one of the things that I've been looking at, and I did read the HBR article about this. So it's great to hear you describe this. We're playing in the willingness to pay space. So we have a very unique product. We are. It's a difficult market because we're selling to governments, but it's a high value, very high value product. One of the things that we don't hear much about is the value of time in all of this. And so what I've observed here is by really focusing on the high value market and really looking always at differentiation. So always on the willingness to pay side. What that does is when I have a premium price, I can move faster by not negotiating on price at the willingness to sell side of things. So I can go to suppliers, really my critical suppliers, and I know that some of my competitors or co-op, various parties that they deal with, they'll come in and there's this huge process to justify the price and negotiate the price. And I roll in and I say, what's your price? I do that, and then I break it down and I make sure that I'm buying the value that I'm looking for. But because I have a premium price and good margins, I can move ahead of my competitors in capturing key suppliers. I can make things happen, and then additional value I bring to my customers. I can deliver a radar system in 12 months, and other people are looking at 2 to 3 years. So that willingness to pay side has a temporal factor that I find very, very valuable.
Yeah. It's a great story, and it's an interesting point. It's a little bit of tension that you see in many supplier relationships. Right? Presumably, we're using suppliers because they know something that we don't know. They have capabilities that we have not developed in-house. And then at the same time, in so many of these relationships, you see specifications that go down to, oh my God, I cannot believe how you hamstring the supplier. And I think often it happens in the context of procurement processes that are geared towards giving us apples to apples comparison. But it destroys any opportunity for the supplier to be meaningfully differentiated and actually come up with something really amazing. I'll tell you one story that I've always loved. When the Tata Group in India developed its first car, it went to Bosch, the engine development company, and it basically gave them 2 numbers. It said, here's the weight of the car, and here's what we're going to pay for the engine. Done. And what did Bosch do? They came out with the most innovative engines we had in 2 decades. Why? We didn't hamstring them. We gave them the a little bit like what you do, right? Which I really love the story. What you do, like we let them do their thing. And as a result, we jointly created much more value than we could have as individuals.
Well, thank you for that. Your discussion about over-specifying just described my last 30 days with the prime contractor I'm dealing with. So right in the gut, that story.
I'm sorry to hear.
But that's okay. We got the order last Friday, so it's okay. I wanted to ask, and I don't want to dominate this, but I was really interested in the bank map, or both of the value maps you put up. If there's time, I would really welcome you to sort of use an example of how one would interpret that value map and sort of go to your guideline to create it. I like the model a lot.
Yeah.
But I see there's a potential there to look at this. Well, I'll just look at everywhere where I'm below the leader and invest in all of those.
Yeah.
And that goes exactly against what you were describing.
Exactly, yes,
so if you could talk a little bit about how one might interpret as the bank 2, 3, or 4, as opposed to the lead that you see on there.
So in the simplest of terms, the difficulty is you want your value curve to go from top right to bottom left, right? You really excel at where the customer pays the most attention, and then you don't invest so much where the customer doesn't care. And if it was that, strategy would be even simpler than it actually is. But you also want to make sure that if your slanted value curve is exactly like the competitor slanted value curve, that's not good either. So you want to think about both of these things, like reallocate resources from uses that don't do much for willingness to pay or willingness to sell to where they have bigger impact, but at the same time create differentiation. And maybe I can tell one story of a company I worked with that I think is indicative. So they're in technology consulting, and as all technology consulting firms, there's just this brutal battle for talent. And they're a mid-sized firm, so they're not at the top of the game, and it was super, super hard. And so they did one of these value maps, and one of the things that they noticed is that there was a fraction of consultants in the market who really didn't like to travel. This idea that you leave your office on Monday morning and come back Thursday night was just like, it was like the worst part of the job. It's what they didn't like. And then when they looked at their customer value maps, they found that mid-sized businesses, often privately held, they actually like the idea of having a tech consultant, not somewhere in India, but someone who would come to their premises. What did they do? They combined these two maps, and they now have this beautiful value proposition where they say, if you work for us, you don't have to travel much. And they tell the clients, oh, and actually typically we would come to your facilities and we would do our work where you are. As a result, they always grew very fast, but they grew very fast at minimal margins. They roughly doubled their growth and they're quadrupled their margins. They're out of this world profitable because they now have a value proposition that comes out of these two value maps that is not good for everyone, right? You look at some people look at the company and say, what do you mean? Like, I don't get to travel. Are you crazy? That's the reason why I wanted to be a consultant. But there's this other segment. And if you capture that, I think that can be really powerful.
Thank you.
Ankush, you had a question also.
Hello. First of all, really nice presentation. You went through it very smoothly. Similar to Kay, I am from Alberta in energy sector, and what we are facing recently is very quick changes in legislation, and most industries now can relate to it. Since we've been hit with pandemic, we'll see, in Alberta, since yesterday now we are in state of health emergency. So businesses are facing changes in their legislation that is leading to change in the strategies and value map. We've also seen a significant change in value map of the employee force since pandemic has hit, whether it's working from home, whether it's pay structure, whether it's mixed strategy. How do you see this many changes happening at the same time? Because at least in our lifetime, we've not seen this many changes in an industry. How do you see this going ahead? Can it last forever? Is it sustainable? And how can an organization plan for its short-term and long-term success? I know I've asked too many questions, I guess.
No, it's fine. It's like, and of course, you're exactly right? It's like, who would have, I had my grandfather experienced the Spanish flu. And he had these stories about, as a kid, wearing the mask and all of that. And I always thought, like, oh my God, I will never experience something like this. And then sure enough, it's like, but yeah, so lots of changes. One of the things I think that is really important, as you think about these value drivers on the value map, the art is to land somewhere in between willingness to pay and the current product and the current practices that you have. If you're too abstract, you talk about willingness to pay, but it's not clear what the value drivers are, that's not really helpful because it doesn't really tell you what to do on Monday morning. But if you're too specific, if you say, oh, actually, I'm fulfilling my customers' needs with this particular product in this particular fashion, that then gets you into this mode that you say, oh my God, and what I can and what I cannot do changes every day. And so the trick is to choose value drivers that describe a real customer need, but in general enough terms so that you can be flexible about how you meet these needs. Let me give you an example. If one of your value drivers is convenience, how you do convenience today is, of course, so different from how you would have done convenience 10 years ago. But think about your marketing, think about the perception, the reputation of your firm. All of that could stay the same, right? So you could compete under the hood, you compete very differently, but you're known for the company that provides great convenience and you do it differently. But generally speaking, it's the same value driver still. And that's what I see many of the most successful companies do. They have things that are not too specific, not exactly describing what you do today, but value drivers that are general enough so that I know I'm going to do it differently, but will give you the same thing. The second thing that I'll say is, and we fall into this trap, I don't know if this is as true in Canada as it is here in the United States. So flexibility of the workforce is a big deal now. Where do we end up? Well, Google says we're probably going to ask people to come back for 2 days. Next thing you see, there's another 800 companies who say, oh, yeah, we'll ask people to come back for 2 days. No, it's like, don't imitate, don't be the same. We understand flexibility has changed in value, but we know from pre-pandemic surveys that there's 7 dimensions of flexibility that people really care about. How on earth did we get into a situation where we basically have 2 or 3 ideas how to do this? And everybody does the same thing. It's driving me nuts. As opposed to say, no, actually, I'm the guy who asks you to come to the office every day. And then guess what? Once a month, you have a 4-day weekend. Oh, maybe, I don't know, maybe a terrible idea, maybe a good idea, but it's a little different from what everybody else does. And so I hope you have this into it. Like, just think about differences. Everything comes in different. Everything that matters comes in differences. And so the sort of this thinking in differences, I think is really a key to being successful.
Well, thank you. You've covered almost everything.
Thank you. Okay, do we have more questions still?
Michael earlier was thinking of asking a question, but I'm not sure if that question may have been covered.
Can I ask the ESG one then? I think it's also important. How does ESG and the influence of these factors contribute to a willingness to buy? I think it's important and nowadays. Thank you.
So important. So 2 things. ESG on the willingness to pay side, almost no evidence that it matters. This is sort of 20 years of academic research. You know how academics sometimes have these ideas and then we really wish it was true. And so everybody was trying to figure out, aren't there somehow ways we can increase willingness to pay as a result of great ESG practices? And the answer is, there are very few companies. Think of Patagonia, right? It works for Patagonia, that whole brand and sustainability and the image that they have built up. Is there an increase in willingness to pay? Absolutely. We actually have a great Patagonia case at HBS if you're interested in how exactly they did this. But generally speaking, ESG on the willingness to pay side, not that important. ESG on the willingness to sell side among talent, if you have a terrible reputation, you're tough luck. Super, super hard to get really talented people to work for you. I see it on, I had responsibility for the HBS MBA program for a couple of years. And so I followed these recruiting trends very closely. And I see it now, like if you perform poorly on any of the ESG dimensions that people care about, you can offer like top salaries, amazing career development opportunities, and you will strike out. In particular, younger talent is just not interested. If you ask the current class at HBS, it's like, would they ever join, one of the companies that has not such a great reputation? It's just, there is no interest. And so it's a great question because it's one of these things where we so hope that customers will be willing to pay for more sustainability and all of that. And it's just generally not true. But in the talent side, it will be absolutely decisive to be a company. And then you want to think about these selection effects. So I'll give you one example. This is like a large financial services company. And they were thinking about what's the right positioning vis-a-vis climate change. And in the beginning, their intuition was, we probably want to be one of the, they're a global bank, so we probably want to be, because it's a global problem, we want to be one of the leading banks. And then in the conversation, it turned from how do we attract people to the selection effect. Remember how I talked about the selection effect? Which kinds of people will you attract if you're absolutely leading on the global climate change front? And they thought that many of their other practices, in fact, many of the business opportunities would be at a tension with having the greenest financial services workforce in the industry. And so they decided to be in the top 20%, but not be a leader. Why? Because they feared the selection effect. It's a little bit like, remember Google, don't do evil? Next thing you know, I have contracts with the State Department and I do not so nice things in China. Where does the revolution come from? It comes from your own staff, because that's why they chose to work for Google in the first place. And so whenever you change willingness to pay or change willingness to sell, think about both of these dimensions, right? So how much value do you create? Who do you, and then, but also what's the selection effect? Who do you attract? And I think, Kapil, yes, I see now you raised your hand.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Ask a question about the tech industry and particularly the creator economy. So I'm curious kind of how you would apply all this thinking to creator platforms like a Patreon, where you've got creators on one end and consumers on the other end, and as a business you're in the middle facilitating a transaction where there's a pretty significant free component as well, and how you'd apply the willingness to pay, willingness to sell concepts.
Yeah, wonderful. It's a fantastic question. In fact, you will see in the book, there are 2 chapters on platforms and network effects. So the fabulous news is if you do this well, and if you have many creatives, and if you have many businesses or customers, that creates platform network effects. I want to be on the platform because the other side is particularly rich, and the other side wants to be in the platform. And so obviously Google is like that, Amazon is like that. That's a very common business model. I would say 2 things that are interesting, at least to me, and then maybe there's something else that you want to ask to follow up. Usually we measure these network effects in the number of users or the number of businesses that use a particular platform. And that is a misguided characteristic, because it doesn't take into account the value that is actually created by having a particular group of creators or a particular group of consumers on the platform. And you see this in the biggest threat to a platform is indiscriminate growth. If you just take whoever wants to join your platform, joins your platform, and before you know it, you have lots of activity, but you create very little value. So thinking about how is it that a particular participant on the platform creates value for the other side of the platform, that is really important. That is really important to see. You see it in companies like Twitter as a platform, where they have essentially driven out. It's just a few conversations that happen now on Twitter. Why? Because they were really indiscriminate in who they let the platform use. Facebook was marvelous about engineering value when it grew its platform. You might remember they started out just as Harvard, right? Why? What's the intuition? Oh, people who study at Harvard, they really value connections to one another. And then they did Ivy Leagues, and then they did all the universities, and finally they opened it up. So that's the first thing. As you're building a platform, really don't think about numbers. Don't think there's this really ugly word, blitz scaling now. That is complete idiocy. That's indiscriminate growth that undermines value in every way you can imagine. And then the second thing to think about is you go back probably 15, 20 years, And the view in Silicon Valley was that all of these platforms are winner take all. The reason why we threw so much capital at them, it was like, oh my God, like everything is going to be like Facebook. And now it turns out there are amazing opportunities to be a small platform that lives comfortably in the shadow of larger platforms. And the book has a whole sort of a taxonomy of how to think about it. If you're, what's a good example? If you're Etsy and you're really small and you're competing against Amazon, and then the big Amazon nasty, they create a business called Amazon Handmade that is essentially designed to kill you. Like, what's your response? And what I show in the book is that there are many ways to respond. There are many ways to survive.
Thank you, Felix. And I see Nathan has a hand up and is our last question on video.
Felix, first of all, great to see you again. I just remember how mind-blowing this was sitting in the classroom. It can't be this simple. So the book is fabulous.
It's great to see you, Nathan.
Thank you,
I'm
sir.
glad you're here.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be with you. Felix, the maps in the book are not as complex or not as laid out as the ones you just showed us earlier. How do you authentically gauge what's most important to the customer? It seems to me like surveys and things like that really don't get something that you can rely on.
Yes. So the most important part about the data collection, so what I love about value-based strategy is that it's all data-based, right? So it's not anecdote, it's not your view or my view, it just comes from the data. But the key thing when you collect the data is to create trade-offs for the survey participants. So if I go out to customers and ask, what do you want? Like you ask me, of course, my answer is I want everything and I want it for free. That's not particularly helpful. So often when I work with companies, often what we do is we give people 100 points. We establish the value drivers, typically with focus groups. I have had the best success getting really reliable results from focus groups, where you have in-depth conversations about how they choose between different companies. And then once I have the value drivers and I need to assess their relative importance, I give them 100 points and I have them allocate the 100 points to the different value drivers. And that's one way to create a trade-off, where other people have, these Likert scales where you scale from 1 to 5, things like this. That works also. But you cannot fall into the trap of just asking customers what they want, because that just gives back noise that is really hard to work with. I should also say, I think in practice, my experience is, in the end, you want to double down on value drivers, sort of on a family of value drivers that you can move with similar investments across several dimensions. And so practically speaking, it will not matter that much if something value driver number 1 or value driver number 2. What you really need to know is, like, what are the top 3 criteria when people choose their dentist? That's the kind of thing you want to know. And then what are the kinds of things where I might invest, but basically people don't care, so that you can take those dollars, that you can take those resources and reallocate them. That's really what's critical. Value maps are typically revised, let's say maybe every 2 or 3 years or so, as technology changes, as consumer tastes change. In some industries a little faster, in some industries a little slower. But what's beautiful about this approach is you establish this once, and then you don't have to do these big strategy exercises that we do in so many companies, right? It's a living system that will accompany you over long periods of time, and that will guide you in the resource allocation inside your firm.
Very useful. Thank you.
Felix, thank you very much for this insightful discussion. I've just shared a link to Better, Simpler Strategy in the chat. If people have not picked up a copy, we seriously think that they should, and learn more from your insights. And thank you again for joining us and sharing these perspectives and your time.
And a great applause to Boris and Kay for getting us together. It always takes a few active people to make it happen. So thank you very much, Boris. Thank you, Kay.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Felix. Bye. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night and have a great day to folks in Asia and Australia.